So then, the United States has announced criminal charges against former Cuban President Raul Castro over the downing of two civilian aircraft in 1996. Castro and several others are charged with conspiracy to kill U.S. nationals, murder and destruction of aircraft. 4 people were killed when Cuban military jets shot down planes operated by a Cuban exile group. Acting U.S. Attorney General Blanche says Castro oversaw the chain of command at the time, calling the indictment a step towards accountability.
The United States and President Trump does not and will not forget its citizens. For the first time in nearly 70 years, senior leadership of the Cuban regime has been charged in this country, in the United States of America, for acts of violence resulting in the deaths of American citizens. Nations and their leaders cannot be permitted to target Americans, kill them, and not face accountability. President Trump is committed to restoring a very simple but important principle. If you kill Americans, we will pursue you, no matter who you are, no matter what title you hold, and in this case, no matter how much time has passed.
So, Raul Castro played a role in Cuba's 1959 revolution, fighting alongside his brother, Fidel Castro, to overthrow the US-backed government. Raul Castro served as defense minister for nearly 5 decades and became one of the country's most powerful political figures. He took over as president from his brother in 2008 and led the island nation for a decade. Castro restored Cuba's diplomatic ties with the United States in 2015, and that ended more than 50 years without formal relations. He stepped down as Communist Party leader in 2021, but still remains an influential political figure. So we'll be crossing live to our correspondents in Havana and Santiago in just a moment. But first, let's start with our White House correspondent, Kimberly Halkett. So, Kimberly, why is this happening now, 3 decades on from the incident itself?
There's no question that this has been an indictment that has been a long time in coming, more than a generation. What seems to have shifted now is the political environment that we find ourselves in the United States. Not only is there more of a political appetite to go after American adversaries, as we've seen in Venezuela, also in Iran, and potentially now, although the U.S. president hasn't formally announced any military action against Cuba, he certainly has also not ruled it out. But what we are also seeing is ongoing pressure that has escalated from Cuban-American lawmakers in the U.S. state of Florida, where much of the diaspora from Cuba lives. And as well, we've really seen the recognition on the part of the Trump administration of opportunity. And that comes from the fact that the blockade put in place by the United States has led to enormous shortages in Cuba when it comes to energy, when it comes to food. And as a result, there is a feeling now that the United States can convey its political message and desires directly to the Cuban population and potentially signal to its elites as well that change is possible when it comes to the leadership in Cuba.
Kimberly, thanks for that. From Washington, D.C. to Havana, we can speak to Ed Augustin, who's live for us there. So, Ed, what's being said in Cuba about these latest developments?
Well, the Cuban president went on Twitter not long ago and denounced, as expected, not yet the indictment, but Marco Rubio's words that he posted on X, in which Secretary of State Rubio claimed that it is not the petrol blockade that is causing power cuts in Cuba. Cuba's President Miguel Diaz-Canel rebutted that, or tried to rebut that, by describing it as cynical. That claim, that his position is, of course, that the US blockade is not the only problem in the country, but is the fundamental problem leading to power cuts.
OK, well, let's get the view from the rest of South America now. Latin America editor Lucia Newman live for us in Chile's capital of Santiago. Lucia, of course, LATAM nations watched as the US went in and took President Maduro in Venezuela. How will this focus on Cuba now be received?
For a long long time now, many countries in Latin America, depending on the political stance of their governments, have been very concerned as they have watched the Cuban people especially going progressively downhill without electricity, without access to medicine, to hospitals, to transportation, and of course also to food, because this fuel blockade now is has been going on since January. This isn't just something that began. It's becoming worse and worse, and the government has announced that there isn't another drop of fuel left in the whole country, in that entire island. Now, the interesting thing is that the government of the United States is offering a carrot to the Cuban people, saying, if you come along with us, the United States is willing to help you all become wealthy, prosperous, like the Cuban Americans that have left the country and gone to the U.S. or other nations around the world. It's only you who are suffering because of the government you have. So it is an invitation, in the view of many people I've been speaking to basically rise up against the government at this stage, where people have no fuel, they're angry, they're frustrated. If ever there is the possibility of destabilization, political destabilization from within Cuba, one would argue that it could be now. The government is saying it's not going to budge. The Latin American leaders are watching, and many are concerned that by indicting the former president and defense minister, this could potentially lead to U.S. military action to try to take him out, as they did with Nicolás Maduro. But that in itself would not necessarily change what's happening with the government there, because there is no one else that they can talk to. So it's a very, very uncertain time right now, and nobody really knows where it's going.
All right, Lucia, thanks for that. Lucia Newman there in Santiago. Let's nip back to Cuba, to Havana. Ed Augustin is there. So, Ed, not, of course, the first time we have heard about regime change from the US government. Even a few hours back, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, he was offering Cubans a new path forward and a new chapter between the United States and Cuba. How do comments like that play out within the country?
It's just more of the same. This is, as Lucia mapped out, it's an invitation for the Cuban people to rise up. Now there's internet these days, so he can beam that into the country directly, and those who've got internet or electricity on their phone can watch it. So they can get that message in easier than before. In fact, the Brothers to the Rescue flights, which we're talking about today, leafleted multiple times over Havana, leaflets saying, rise up. You know, so these days you don't have to have planes go in. You don't have to allow the exiles to file false flight plans. But the message is the same: rise up and overthrow the government. And the U.S. Economic war on Cuba and the Cuban people is premised on the same idea. The infamous quote from what's called the Mallory Memorandum from the State Department back in 1960 said that policy towards Cuba should aim to bring about, quote, hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government. 2/3 of a century have passed since then. They got the first two, lots of hunger, even more desperation. They still haven't overthrown the government. And so Cuban people just listen to this and kind of think, well, what's new? You know, it's been going on since our grandparents were born. And the bigger context, I think, the reason why this indictment went ahead, the reason why over the last week we've seen more military threats, direct, explicit threats of military intervention in Cuba, is because President Trump himself has become frustrated, as reported by NBC News and Bloomberg, that the Cuban government is so stubborn. To put it in simple terms, they are refusing to surrender. When you have the head of the CIA come to Cuba and say, implement the economic reforms we want and we demand, and the political reforms we want and we demand, you, a sovereign country, must do it. You're asking them to surrender. That is completely incompatible with international law, and the Cubans will not do it. And I think it's difficult to imagine another country, at least in Latin America, that it would be so stubborn, especially now they've lost their main ally, Venezuela, and they have almost no oil coming in, Russia and China not helping out as much as the Cuban leadership would like, and it's still just not willing to budge. They do not see it, this government or regime, if you prefer, as about human rights and democracy. They see it about a question of sovereignty. And on that, I believe they're willing to die.
Ed Augustin reporting there as the United States announces criminal charges against former Cuban President Raul Castro. Thanks, Ed.